Hi, everyone. What a privilege it is to have an opportunity to talk with all of you today. Thank you for joining. My name's Tom Glaser, and I'm a security assessor with RSI Security. I'll be talking to you here for probably about 40 minutes with some time at the end for Q&A. You do have a Q&A um, option there on your screen, and you can send me some questions. And throughout the course of the presentation, I'll be sure to respond to all of those, but probably not until the end, just so that we can flow through the discussion topics that I have planned for you. And I can see all of you have joined. I see Bruce Liegerman. Bruce, great to have you with. Please no heckling till the end, okay, Bruce? Thank you. Brenda, what a great privilege it is. It's great to see you attending. I see we've got David and Greg, Imran, Jacob, Joshua, Jared. Thank you all. So with this particular presentation, I have in mind of kind of the target audience of those of you who are attending that, I believe this information is going to be the most useful to. So I'd like to start there. Let's talk about, the value of the time you're putting into this particular time slot in this presentation, return on investment with the HITRUST certification. And, from my perspective as a security assessor, I see this as a presentation that would be for somebody who might be a decision maker for an organization who's looking at their options, someone who may have been assigned the honor of coming to this particular presentation to bring back some information that that will be helpful to the executive team as you go through your decision process of setting up your security program and maturing it. And I also see, of course, that we have some colleagues and coworkers in the security industry and consultants. It would be great to have any input that you have as I go through these talking points. And thank you all again. So let's get started. I work for RSI Security. I'm a security assessor and an auditor. A little bit about me. I have a lot of fun doing audits. I love to smile, and so I make people really nervous during an audit. And I'll notice too if when I come up and I'm smiling and I'm talking, let's say to your CTO, then if I have a little bit of laugh going on, it really kind of puts somebody over the top. Like, why is this auditor in such a great mood? He's smiling and he's laughing. What did he find? But in truth, I take the work very seriously, and that's why I like to work for RSI, because we're a security firm with about 50 full-time employees, and we have the opportunity to put all of our focus and attention on every customer. And that's a great culture to work for, especially for someone like myself. I've been in the industry about 20 years, starting with IBM, and I've performed security assessments across many different security frameworks, such as PCI, NIST, HITRUST, of course, the CIS, CSC. So, I consider myself to be a generalist in information security with an IT audit background, as I've grown in the industry as an assessor. So what we're going to focus on today, really, it's going to be about, when we talk about ROI, I want to talk about both sides of the equation. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'm talking about what is involved on the investment side of going through a HITRUST certification. So we want to take a look at that. We want to take a look at, what are you signing up for? When we're talking about HITRUST and we're talking about certifying in a validation audit. And of course, what are the benefits of that investment that you're making? So we're going to look at both sides. In the course of that discussion, we're going to touch on a couple other topics. And I know looking at the agenda, some of these are other breakout sessions that you may find. You may sign up to see these other topics in a little bit more detail, but they do also fit into the discussion. So we're looking at scoping strategy. We're looking at how HITRUST compares with other information security programs. And we're looking at the ever-changing threat and risk landscape that we're all dealing with. I'll kind of start out with an audit joke because that's a great way to get started, right? So why did the auditor cross the road? The answer to the joke is, well, because that's the way we did it last year. But, if we think about it more seriously, we can't do what we did last year anymore. The game has changed for all of us. And how are we going to manage through this new environment that we're all operating in? And what are some of the approaches that we can be more effective at? So that's something that we're going to talk about, and how HITRUST is a big part of that, I believe, for all of you, especially those of you going through a decision process on what are your options as you're looking at maturing your security program. So I'd like to spend a minute here talking about what's top of mind for all of you attending this presentation. What are some of the things that that are the greatest concerns that you have as you're going through and listening to these various presentations? And I just thought I'd share a few that come up relatively frequently while I'm in the course of my business meetings. And I think the first one, is so important because we're talking about customer assurance. We're talking about assurance in general, not just from your customers, also from your stakeholders, from your executives and your board of directors. And assurance has become, kind of a game changer for us because it's no longer just enough to differentiate our product and service. We have this other matter in vendor selection of, well, what about data security? Well, how can you assure me that if I work with you, that you're going to be a good steward of the data, not only, about that we may be transferring to you, but that may arise in the course of providing your service. So all of a sudden, you have to go through that. Secondly, we're talking about compliance risk. Well, we have an ever-changing environment now in the compliance realm. We have state regulations. We have ongoing changes that are impacting your ability to stay current. So we're going to be sharing with you, why is HITRUST positioned to help you deal with compliance risk? What's the difference between HITRUST and some of the other frameworks? And I think lastly, we're talking about the matter of audit fatigue. HITRUST is designed to be an assess once and address many, one-to-many type of security framework. So while it is a greater investment in some cases than other frameworks, it's addressing multiple compliance requirements, which in turn addresses the audit fatigue factor that many of your organizations may be experiencing as you're trying to directly address each and every regulatory compliance requirement that's coming up. So we're going to share a little bit about how HITRUST does that and what's the benefit of going through a framework like HITRUST. Well, looking at how much do you understand already about HITRUST, and what are the most important features of HITRUST that you should be aware of as you start to think about make decisions about maturing your program. I would like to offer to all of you is kind of the one takeaway that I would present to you about HITRUST as we go through this presentation. I believe that the most important is this. HITRUST is going to give you the ability in your dealings with your customers and your stakeholders to accelerate through the discussion around assurance, specifically around data security, specifically around managing risk. The reason that works is because HITRUST brings the level of rigor and the industry recognition of that certification to the table so that you can kind of in a short answer say, well, we're HITRUST certified. This gives your sales team the ability to quickly address initial concerns of prospective customers. It allows you to quickly enter into discussions of concerns coming from, for instance, the board of directors as they are looking at, well, what's our risk appetite and how much have we done to address our concerns? So I think if there's one thing that HITRUST is going to do better than any other option that you're looking at, it's this idea that you're going to be accelerating through those discussions. Why? Because you've taken the rigor and the investment in and certified with HITRUST. You've gone through that validation. And that certification carries a very strong reputation. Certainly, depending on the industry, it's the best certification and most highly recognized certification. So we're going to talk about that. I also want to mention a resource that you can take a look at. This is available in the download section of the resource tab in the auditorium view, and it's called the HITRUST C-Level Overview. It just captures in general a lot of the topic and the discussion points that we're going to be covering. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I'm not going to read off all these bullets. I mean, you're certainly, I think that we all have PowerPoint fatigue that happens during these presentations. So, I'm mostly interested in embellishing the information that we're presenting on this slide. But I will say that the adoption piece is so important because if you're going to make the investment and going through and what we're going to cover as far as what this is going to take, you want to, at the minimum, you want to be able to carry the recognition around that certification and have the impact that you're trying to get as you go through, for instance, responding to your customer concerns around your data assurance. So again, we're going to talk about both sides of the equation. So to begin with, what are the investment requirements? What are you getting yourself into with HITRUST? What could you expect? First and foremost, you're going to be looking at a commitment that's going to be organizational. So what do I mean by that? Well, you're going to be pulling in your IT staff. You're going to be pulling in your compliance team. And we're talking about someone with a strong understanding of the overall workings within the organization. So typically, we're looking at a management level resource that's going to be heavily involved in the process. You're going to also need someone who can serve as a coordinator throughout the process, going back and forth with your internal team, responding to assessment requests that are necessary in order to progress the process and go through the validation audit. So what I typically outline is you can expect an internal resource, and it may be distributed across a couple different roles. You can expect 20 to 30 hours a week of that internal resource time. And that could go on, for 2 to 3 months, depending on what your security posture is going into the process, how much remediation work is involved to get in the readiness phase prior to going into the validation audit. So it's a big commitment on your internal resource team as you're going through the process. And I think it's very important to understand that as you're looking at the overall investment. I also would like to mention that there's typically a substantial effort around technical writing. T teams are not super excited about writing up procedural documentation. That's been my experience in 20 years. So you're going to have either the organization who has the acumen to go ahead and do technical writing, or you're going to be looking to the outside for some assistance to work with your technical team, building out procedural level documentation. It's essential, and we're going to go into that a little bit more here as we go through the slides. So overall, we're talking about an internal investment of 1 to 2 staff members for a number of months as you go through the process. Now, additionally, you've got some indirect cost that is going to arise as you go through the readiness process, ready for the validation audit. As you look through this bullet list, you'll see that many of these tools will require an indirect investment by the organization in order to begin to meet the standards that you'll be evaluated against as you go through HITRUST. So in many cases, remediation work that's going to be necessary to address some of the tools and processes here can prolong your end-to-end duration of the project. So for instance, you go through the initial readiness advisory, and we're going to look at the timeline here in a couple slides, but let's, for the sake of discussion, you go through a readiness review. You typically know that as a gap assessment. And out of that gap assessment, 3 or 4 of these bullets come up of these tools or processes that need to be remediated. Some of this remediation is not going to take a matter of 2 days. It could take weeks. You could be looking at a couple months, depending on resource and budget, in order to address some of the gaps that may arise. So again, it's an indirect cost. It's a cost that's necessary in order to go through with the validation process, but it's going to be a cost that is kind of separate from looking at, well, what's the overall investment of HITRUST. So I call these indirect costs. Very important to keep that in mind, especially when you think about the impact to your overall timeline. And if you're driving toward a hard deadline and some of these items require remediation, it could be very difficult to effectively meet that deadline. So we've talked a little bit about the internal investment, and let's talk about some of the direct cost around executing the HITRUST assessment itself. So you're going to subscribe to the MyCSF portal. That's the only way you're going to go through and get a HITRUST validation. It's not available any other way. You have to go through the MyCSF portal. You're going to be benefiting from that portal, and we're going to talk about that as well. But it's a subscription that does vary depending on some aspects of your organization. That is set up directly with HITRUST, and you would work with HITRUST to determine the appropriate level of subscription based on the assessment that you're going to perform and some of the characteristics of your organization. So you might think of it something like a sliding scale, depending on the size of your organization and the type of assessment that you're going to conduct. So you've got the cost of the portal subscription, and then you've got the cost of going through an advisory and an assessment project. So for instance, You have it's necessary to go through some readiness uh, in order to prepare for the validation audit. There's no way for you to get a HITRUST certification without having an external HITRUST assessor conducting the audit. So you're going to have to go to a security firm like RSI. You're going to have to work out, negotiate a project with that firm. Those costs are going to vary. I'm not going to go into specific numbers on this presentation, but it's going to be necessary. So you've got the external cost of your portal subscription, you've got the external cost of your audit, of your validation audit, and then depending on the posture of your organization going into this process, you're going to have cost around an initial advisory we call readiness advisory. So let's take a look, for instance, this would be the R2 typical timeline. So this is the HITRUST validation assessment timeline for the R2. And you can see here for you into some various phases of the project. Initially, you're going to be working with an external assessor, and you're going to be understanding what's the scope going to be. We call it the scoping exercise of the audit. This is something that you conduct the audit. For instance, you may have an organization that may have subsidiaries, you may have different lines of business, and you may determine that it's advantageous, at least to get started, to focus in on just one subsidiary or a very specific line of business. HITRUST gives you the ability to define that boundary and assess within that particular scope within your organization. It's very important because it allows you to focus your effort in, let's say, a couple of very specific departments as they go through the rigor and the audit process, while the rest of the organization would fall out of scope of many of these security controls. So it's very important to look at your scoping strategy and look at what's really the most important area for your organization as we go into looking at kind of the benefits of carrying the HITRUST validation. So once you conduct that scoping exercise, you would then work with an assessor firm on ensuring that you are prepared to begin the audit. We call that readiness advisory. We're going to take you might think of it like a gap assessment, take a dry run through the control descriptions, and we're going to look at how do your security controls evaluate against the HITRUST evaluation criteria. That's going to give you an understanding of what's needed within your organization, what kind of remediation are you going to need to go through in order to be ready for that audit. We typically call that a remediation roadmap. That's, again, when we think about the bullet list, when we talked about your internal costs and your security controls, how many of those are going to come up as you go through that gap assessment? It's going to have a lot to do with the effort and the investment required in remediation. Once you satisfy the gap assessment and you've determined that you're now ready to move forward with the validation audit, then you have a period where you're, if you're familiar with the SOC 2 audit, where you have 2 to 3 months of running the actual security controls and building up evidence that are going to be necessary, these evidence items, in order to satisfy the audit criteria as you enter into the validation audit. So as you think about it, that's going to extend this timeline out. Once you complete your readiness and your gap assessment, You go through that remediation. Now you have a period where those controls need to be implemented operationally, and you're gathering evidence, preparing to provide that evidence during the audit itself. As you go into the validation audit, you can expect to be, again, utilizing your internal resources in providing the evidence items that are going to be necessary for the controls and the control descriptions. Every control has a control description, and each control description is evaluated against a minimum of 3 criteria. That would be policy, process, and implementation, meaning that for each of the controls that you go through, you're going to need to have the appropriate level of documentation reflected in your policy documents, represented in procedural documentation, and then something that's evidentiary, something that we can take, for instance, a screenshot that will show that, in fact, that control has been implemented within your environment that you've determined to be in scope. So there's a kind of a multiplicative effect as you go through and look at, okay, here's my control set. Well, yeah, you're going to be evaluated on that control set. Absolutely. But not only that, you have to satisfy at the minimum 3 evaluation criteria against each of those control descriptions. So we've kind of broken out some of these, and with the some of the changes with HITRUST and some of the products, as we're going to talk about here in a couple slides. I don't want to spend too much time here because the total number of controls are going to vary depending on the options that you choose in the particular approach you take with HITRUST. But again, the point of this is that control is going to require that you satisfy very specific criteria. And you may have heard in different terminology such as prescriptive, where you're lining up against a control description that is going to be very specific about what you have to do in order to satisfy the criteria of that control. So it's not the type of exercise, for instance, where you can subjectively respond to how you address a particular control. Some of you may have experience, for instance, with vendor security reviews, where you've been able to kind of respond with an answer. Well, here's what we do that would, maybe somewhat address your question about a particular security control. In the course of HITRUST, you're going to have to very specifically address each of these control descriptions. And the fact that you may do something that's relatively close to the requirement, there is the ability within HITRUST to document what we call mitigating controls, where it's appropriate, where we can address those during the validation audit. But as a general practice, should you expect to be able to do that numerous times? Most likely not. You'll probably be able to describe a mitigating control for 1 or 2 of the control descriptions. But overall, we're going to have to very specifically address each and every control description that we're meeting in the audit, validation audit. So let's talk about some of the changes that HITRUST is presenting to us. I'm really excited about the work that's been done here, because this is really a way for any organization to come in to build up their security program in such a way that they can start with the HITRUST Basic, which is which can be conducted as a self-assessment or with an outside firm as an advisory project, where you can go through and without going through the validation audit, you basically get to go through what you'd be familiar with, like a gap assessment. And it's going to allow you to do a couple things for your organization. The first is you're going to have a very good idea of the overall security posture that your organization is. You're going to understand where your starting point is. Secondly, you're going to have the ability in your sales discussions to begin to talk about the HITRUST framework, even though you don't have the validation certification in place. You are able to talk about how you are in the process of aligning to the HITRUST framework. And in my experience, in many cases, that conversation is often enough to allow for the sale process to go forward, to address the initial data security concerns of many companies. And then you begin to negotiate any additional requirements. For instance, well, we'll give you a year, for instance, to go ahead and finish up that process. We're going to want to see a HITRUST certification, let's say within a year of, it would be entered into the contractual provisions that you enter into. So it's a very good starting point for any organization that needs to expand that timeline to begin to build up their maturity program. And we also have the I-1, which is also being presented this year. And the I-1, you can think of it as a very good entry-level certification. So this is a certified HITRUST validation audit. You end up with a certified report when you complete the I-1. But it's been designed to be a very focused assessment that, you might think of it like a baseline of security controls that HITRUST has identified. So this I-1 is going to be the same set of security controls for any organization that opts for this as their their path to HITRUST. We haven't conducted any of these yet. It's very early in the year. But in taking a look at the control set and taking a look at kind of the overall level of effort, this looks to be like a very good in-between for any organization who wants to go ahead and get that certification, but may have work to do to prepare and to go through what you're avoiding the more extensive R2 type of control set. And so let's take a look at that. And with the R2 control set, what you're going through is you're going through an exercise of scoping factors. And this exercise of scoping factors results in a customized control set, very specific to the profile of your organization. Once you go through that scoping exercise, the control set is directly tied to the responses. So as you go through the R2, you're going to be addressing a larger control set. Think about a larger control set. We're talking about more control descriptions. When we, let's just say 260 controls, then you have to think about the fact that every control, you have to satisfy 3 evaluation criteria for every one of those. So there is a kind of a multiplicative effect as you go through the audit in the amount of evidencing that you're doing and the amount of criteria that you have to satisfy in order to certify. And this is very, very important for you to understand when you think about investment, because that level of rigor that makes HITRUST such a highly regarded certification is also a much deeper investment. It's a more rigorous audit. Okay, so I think I've touched on the initial investment. Again, any questions, if you submit some Q&A here at the end, we'll be sure to address anything that I can specifically. Let's start to talk about, well, what's the return after I commit my organization, after we invest in the internal resources, after we invest in the tools and processes that are necessary, and go through this timeline that we looked at. What's there in the other side of the investment. So we want to start to think about your internal and your kind of your external return on investment. So the first and foremost, it's the ability, again, to accelerate through your customers' assurance concerns because you've gone through this process upfront and you're prepared for that question that those customers are going to present to you. How can you satisfy our concerns about being good stewards around the data and the any data transferred, any customer information that we may share while you're doing services. To me, it's a competitive advantage. It may vary from case to case, but as many of you know, when you go through the kind of the vendor security process that many organizations have today, these questionnaires have grown to be fairly extensive. I've talked to some of my clients that have 400 to 500 questions listed on these vendor questionnaires. Each one of those is an opportunity for something to arise that could potentially impact the successful completion of that new business, of getting through those contractual provisions. So you want to, whenever you can, accelerate through that process with maybe what we might call a short answer. Well, look, we're HITRUST certified. In many cases, when you are HITRUST certified, you can completely skip over the vendor security questionnaires just by showing the company to their satisfaction the information they want to see about your HITRUST certification. It's not 100%. There are some organizations that still may require that you do respond to some of their vendor-related questions. But I can tell you from my experience overall, it's going to allow you to substitute the effort that you would typically put into those vendor questionnaires. So you've got the return on the ability to kind of bypass a lot of this vendor onboarding type vendor questionnaire that may arise. We're talking also about internally the improvement of your security posture. There is a term that some of you may be familiar with. We call it residual risk. The idea behind residual risk is that any organization really that conducts business has what we call an inherent risk. It's unavoidable. It's just a part of going through and actually performing the business transaction. So when we talk about residual risk, what we're talking about is we take that inherent risk, we take a look at the level of security controls that are in place to address the inherent risk of simply that comes with running your business. And then the other side of that equation is called residual risk. So as your security posture improves through going through the HITRUST validation audit, your residual risk is going to come down. Your security posture is rising, so the level of security across your organization is going up, and you're bringing down your residual risk. This is the ability to demonstrate to another organization you've gone through that process, you've brought down your residual risk. HITRUST simply puts that into a very formal process with that security certification, that validation audit on the end of it. So again, when you think about being a decision maker, or you think about bringing information back to your organization as you look at your options, you want to take a look at now, what is HITRUST offering to you? And you may very well take a look at the first option here, the HITRUST Basic. And depending on the kind of customer requirements that are coming in, depending on the risk appetite of your executives and your board of directors, you could very well determine that your best choice would be to begin with a HITRUST basic assessment. There are several advantages that I believe come with the HITRUST basic assessment. First and foremost, you've got a long timeline in which you can go through the process of the evaluation criteria that comes with the HITRUST framework, looking at your gaps and remediating those gaps based on the availability of your staff and the budget that's available to address, for instance, those security control gaps. We looked at that bullet list earlier in the slide. So this can extend out the entire process to accommodate budget restraints, staff restraints, if you don't have a very direct requirement pressing on your organization, for instance, to get certified. I personally think this is a very good option because it still allows an organization to bring into the conversation that you do align to the HITRUST framework. You're in the process of going through the basic assessment, and that oftentimes, as I've said, is enough to go forward with the sales process, to bypass initial concerns for many customers around data assurance. And then you can negotiate that timeline as you go through contractual provisions to say, okay, you've gone through your self-assessment. How soon is it going to take you to get certified? How long do you need to do that? Oftentimes you can get 1 to 2 years of a timeline for many companies who know that you've already started that process. So there's that aspect of the HITRUST basic. The second aspect is it's simply lower cost. So your external expenses are going to be lower as far as how much investment are you making with the advisory. You're going through the HITRUST basic audit, which is not the same rigor and the timeline as a certified audit. So you're saving the external costs, and you're also you're not held to any particular time frame in order to refresh that assessment. You might decide that you're going to start with the HITRUST basic, and maybe you'll complete that HITRUST basic every other year, where you're moving out the cycle of your self-assessment. So that in turn is saving you time and resource. It's a great option to think about if you don't have any very specific requirement pressing from an external customer or from your executive team or your board of directors. Then you have the I1, which is, as we talked about, kind of a baseline audit that's going to address the kind of what HITRUST has determined to be kind of the core set of controls that you should be meeting. It's a very good starting point, and it does provide you with a certified audit. So this is bringing in the validation audit into the process. So that's the step up from the HITRUST basic. Now you're going through an advisory period. You're conducting the gap assessment, you're remediating the gap, and you're preparing to go through a validation audit. At the end of that validation audit, that's where you get your certified report, provided you're able to satisfy all the evaluation criteria that are necessary. So it is a way to fast track into a certified report, and it's a great starting point, in my opinion, for an organization who is looking at the need, let's say, from a customer to provide that certified report, but may have work to do in order to go through the higher level of rigor in the R2. And then, of course, you do have the R2, which is a customized control set based on the scoping factors you enter in to the MyCSF portal. And you can look at a minimum of approximately 260 controls. It can vary. And that minimum can certainly go up depending on the scoping factors you enter in. And, that multiplicative effect of every control having 3 evaluation criteria should also be noted here. Because when you go through an audit, you need to remember you have to satisfy the evaluation criteria and provide evidence for every control description on the policy, the process, or the procedural documentation, and evidence of that control being implemented within the organization. So that's an evidence item like a screenshot as an example of demonstrating that you've actually implemented that control. So what the R2 also offers to you is the ability to expand the regulatory factors that are going to be pulled into that audit. For instance, you may have a need to address very specifically some state privacy regulation. For instance, Nevada, California, as an example, Massachusetts, Texas. And we can expect to see that list building up. I'm sure you've seen in the news that there are many states now looking at bringing in more privacy regulation. So HITRUST does allow you to bring in these specific regulatory factors into that control set, which of course is going to have the effect of expanding that control set out. Maybe you start out at the basic of 260, begin to bring in these regulatory factors. That control set's going to grow. You could see a control set of 500, for example, as you're bringing in various regulatory factors. These are all very important considerations to make, as it's going to impact your overall investment. It's going to impact the timeline of the audit, how much evidencing is going to be required during the validation audit. All of that is reliant on that control set. How extensive is it? How many controls do you have to satisfy? Let's differentiate some of what HITRUST has to offer. Again, we're looking at, now that you've made this investment, what's the advantage? What's your return? First off, the MyCSF portal. To my knowledge, the MyCSF portal is by far the best portal available in any security framework. It allows you to track progress. It allows you to capture the evidence, store that evidence within the portal. It is a workflow where it allows the assessor to communicate back to your organization and to communicate up to the HITRUST QA team with any questions or concerns that may arise over the course of that audit. So as, for instance, as review of evidence takes place in the validation audit, the MyCSF portal allows for that communication to be facilitated, and it removes any delays that may take place as you go through the QA process. I've seen this to be very effectively managed through the MyCSF. I want to use the term actively managed. So we talked about, for instance, the privacy regulations and the changes that are taking place. Many states coming in, for instance, bringing in their own set of privacy regulations. HITRUST is actively managed. So every year at the minimum, HITRUST is evaluating all these changes that are taking place across regulatory frameworks, across the threat landscape, data security best practices. All of that is evaluated every year and reflected in the updates that HITRUST will submit in the control revisions of the framework. So while you think about that and you compare that to the other frameworks that are out there, with some exception, and I'll give you an example, I think PCI to an extent is actively managed because they do go through an annual update. or at least an update process as the visa or as the forensics take place from credit card related breaches. The PCI data security standards are updated. However, just keep in mind PCI has a limited scope, whereas HITRUST is addressing a much more comprehensive footprint, with every organization. So you have HITRUST addressing regulatory factors that lie outside of the credit card industry. Then if you compare HITRUST, for instance, to the NIST framework, absolutely the NIST framework is an excellent framework. However, when you talk about actively managed, you're talking about a framework that, if you compared that to the at the minimum an annual update that HITRUST is going through, you're simply not getting the appropriateness of this very quickly changing data and privacy regulatory environment that we're in now. So certainly, for instance, with NIST, you're putting together a security framework. Yes. Are you addressing risks in a very formal way, in a very industry accepted way? Yes. Are you working against a control set that is the most up to date that can be available to you? That's questionable, simply because of this actively managed. We have HITRUST is dedicating staff to do nothing but to keep the control set current. So, this is a big return on investment that I think you should all be aware of as you're going through the decision process. There's too much to keep up with. Even your legal team will most likely often say it's coming to a point where you've got too many updates taking place. You can't really keep your security program current. This is directly addressed by the HITRUST control set, and a big return on investment, in my opinion, because as long as you're keeping your validation up to date, that you're addressing the most current regulatory requirements that are coming out year to year. So the other return on investment is, let's go back to the residual risk description that I provided to you. As you're bringing and raising the maturity of your security program, you're addressing this risk of ineffective cybersecurity. Is there a 100% security program out there? I don't believe so. I think you're always going to be adjusting and improving your security program. Just take a look at the news. The threats are changing so quickly that it's going to be an ongoing process. However, when you address the fundamental security effort, and that is aspects of your security program. Now you're in a position to respond to new threats that are coming in, and you're building on a very strong foundation. So this, from an internal risk management standpoint, is a very significant return for the investment that we've just talked about. Again, we're talking about the threat landscape, and I also just want to mention that you are starting to see some security tools that are coming into play that are helping with kind of the zero-day threats that we're all dealing with. And I would encourage you to take a look at some of these particular tools. And I've seen many of my clients very effectively address this particular zero-day risk. There are various tools, and I'm not going to go into naming any, but I would strongly encourage you, no matter how mature your security program is, to look at how you might leverage some of the security tools around the zero-day threats. Because as we all can see, it's almost out of the reach of any security team to be ahead of the kind of threats that are coming into play. So what I'd like to do is take a little bit of time here to go through Q&A. This is really the extent of the information I wanted to provide as we talk about return on investment. I'll certainly be available in the networking session following this presentation. If you have any additional follow-up questions, I want to thank all of you very much for spending the time here, considering some of these talking points that I provided to you. And again, I'd just like to close with the biggest return on investment with HITRUST, in my opinion, is that ability to accelerate through the assurance concerns of your customers and your stakeholders. Thank you.